Hello and welcome to Rewriting Bad Books. This is a series in which we take a passage from a book that's generally considered to be not particularly good. We have a look at what it's trying to do, why it works, why it doesn't work, and then we rewrite it and offer our own version of it and pick a winner. As is usual, today I am joined by Scott, and today we're going to be doing character descriptions, and we're going to have a look at a passage from Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. So I'll read that to start with. Captain Bezu Fache carried himself like an angry ox, with his wide shoulders thrown back and his chin tucked hard into his chest. His dark hair was slicked back with oil, accentuating an arrow-like widow's peak that divided his jutting brow and preceded him like the prow of a battleship. As he advanced, his dark eyes seemed to scorch the earth before him, radiating a fiery clarity that forecast his reputation for unblinking severity in all matters. Now, I have to say, I actually don't mind the Da Vinci Code. I have read it once. For what it is, I thought it was very effective, and I've discussed that in a couple of videos here and there, not one particularly on the book itself, but as an example of various things that have been going along. I don't really mind this. I mean, this was chosen because it was in the Telegraph or the Times, like 20 bad pieces of writing by Dan Brown or something like that, so that's why we've chosen this. You can have a little look at a few little bits of it, certainly. Like, the reason he has to say angry ox is because the ox is a bad choice of animal. It's what do you associate with ox? It's a beast of burden, sort of almost docility, not anger. That's why you have to say an angry ox. You could just choose a better animal. And then you have this weird position that he gets himself in, with his wide shoulders thrown back and his chin tucked hard into his chest. I mean, perhaps you need a bigger chest than mine. I haven't been hitting the gym as much as I should be, ever. But that to do that actually hurts. And it puts you in a weird sort of position. I'm sure you've seen people walking with their shoulders thrown back but yeah, that's it's a bit weird. And then we have, the dark hair slicked back with oil, and it's like there's something about that speaks of grooming. There's not anything particularly wrong with that, but you have to be a bit wary that doesn't lead into discussion of vanity, particularly because we're going to talk in the next passage about sort of focusing on his work and having nothing else in his life. So, this phrase perhaps is one that we can just do without. Then you get to his widow's peak that divided his jutting brow and preceded him like the prow of a battleship. And it's like, I don't mind the prow of a battleship. It does speak of violence, which quite a lot of this does. Maybe it's a little bit over the top. But I think really the word that we need to look at there is preceded, which I think is not the time for a word that makes people go, huh? And I think that might do that to a few people. He's really want to be using goes before, just like be literal. Like his jutting brow goes before him like the prow of a battleship. I mean, perhaps if you want to be doing a bit more with it, you can look at the difference between perhaps drives and drags, what those two words would do if you'd like driving your forehead forward, or being dragged forward by it. It speaks of your power or not. So I don't know, I think you could do a little bit of tidying up there, and I think it'll be okay. This last part, really does over-exit. He's scorching the earth before him, radiating a fiery clarity. And it's like, clarity? Is that the word you want to be using there? But I think the biggest problem with this is the word forecast, which is just obviously wrong. I think that should be broadcast. Perhaps if you're going for sort of fiery clarity, you could use blazon instead. Like blazoned his reputation for unblinking severity. I like the idea that, although blazon isn't obviously talking about fire in any way, but it does tie in, I think, with the blaze of fire. Those words are sort of, that duality is hinted at. I quite like that. But fiery clarity is like, I'm not really sure what he's going for there. Is he talking about like a fierce concentration on the job at hand, like a dedication or a concentration? Or is he talking about like having a narrow viewpoint or a narrow mindedness, because the two are not quite the same? So I don't know, it's just like there's a lot going on here, but it's not quite right in a way that, you know, if we have a look at something else of this ilk that's just done a bit better, we can have a look at Thomas Gradgrind's introduction, which is like the very first page of Hard Times by Dickens. So he talks about the speaker's square wall of a forehead which has its eyebrows for its brace, this eyes finding commodious cellarage in two dark caves overshadowed by the wall. I think that immediately does more, because, you know, Gradgrind is this wall. He's so rigid, he's so fixed that any amount to try and of persuasion was simply going to just be literally banging your head against a brick wall. You're just not going to get anywhere. He's that stubborn, he's that focused. And again, you know, later on, the speaker's obstinate carriage, his square coat, his square legs, his square shoulders. It's like, again, when you think of a square, it's like there's a number of rules involved in making a square. You know, you have to have 4 sides, 4 equal lengths, 4 right-angled corners, and if any of the rules are broken, then immediately you have something that's not a square. So it really speaks of this determined character, but this rigid character, and to a fault almost. So it's like Dickens is the master of this sort of thing anyway. If we consider his introduction to Scrooge, for example, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scratching, covetous old sinner at a time when being called a sinner was a pretty big deal. He's hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. And the important thing there with the fire as well is the way that the fire is used in A Christmas Carol, always to represent the home, to represent the warmth of the heart. And clearly Scrooge then is described as one not having a home, not belonging anywhere, not having any love to give, but certainly not to have any to receive. So it's like you do so much with just a handful of words. And I think that this is what Dan Brown is trying to do. It's just he's not quite doing it as well, and I don't think that there's any shame in that, because there's very few people that do write quite as well as Dickens. So, but then we can have a look at sort of a more modern text, you know, from somebody else that's considered to be an exceptional writer, and again you can see 1984, George Orwell, like a character description of a handful of lines, less than Dan Brown is using, that describes everything you need to do, but also is foreshadowing other stuff that's going to come into the text. It's talking in a way that's not literal, but I'll read it and you'll see. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagreness of his body merely emphasised by the blue overalls which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine. His skin is roughened by like low quality goods that he's given, like soap and razors, and of course an exposure to a cold winter. But it is the fact that he's lost in this uniform. And we give him precious few details about Winston, really, beyond the colour of his hair and the fact that he's slim, perhaps even more so than slim. You're not really given very much about him, but what you are told is, you know, the meagreness of the body contrasting with the voluminous nature of this oversized uniform that he's lost in. It's like it speaks of emotionally being lost in the apparatus of the party, as well as not having an identity. Really, it's you know, we're talking here about 20 words, and it does so much. And sometimes you do see that. It's like some people give a lot of detail about a character, some people give very little, some people give none at all, and that sort of takes you back to somebody like Murray Leinster in the 30s and 40s, science fiction writer. And Alexei Panshin says that sometimes when the description of the character is not there, that people just don't notice that it's not there. It allows them to form their own picture, to perhaps make them more relatable. But, as Panchin observes, the downside to this is that it makes your characters forgettable. They all sort of blend into one, particularly across a body of work. And Panchin, of course, is talking mostly about Robert Heinlein, who does, like Leinster, give very few details about his characters. And that's why people that are very familiar with Heinlein, that have read a lot of Heinlein, if you say, who's your favourite character, quite often you'll see the names Joe, Jim Gregory, or Isaac Newton, or Lummox, and the three of those are mutants or aliens. They are described physically. So they have a physique that makes them stand out. The fact they're described when nobody else is makes them stand out. And then, of course, they actually do have quite a good character as well. So, they're memorable across the board for all sorts of reasons. And another one that might come up is actually a humanoid character, is Dr. Kiku from Star Beast, the same story as Lummox. And Heinlein does something quite interesting with him in that he doesn't give you any details about how he looks until like the last act of the book, and then he starts to dish out a little bit more here and there, and we realise that Dr. Kiku is actually quite old and frail, whereas before the book had been dominated by his personality, and that hadn't even really sort of been something that would occur to most readers. And it's almost like with the crisis sort of abating, that Dr. Kiku is almost aging before our eyes. It's a very interesting piece of writing, and it's well worth checking out just to see what you can do with a character in that way, and that you can sort of dish out details really slowly for a specific goal. And that's the point as well, is that you must have that specific goal in mind. Yeah, it's certainly what Winston, it's certainly what Orwell is doing when he's talking about Winston. And you can compare his depiction of Winston with his depiction of the girl whose name I've forgotten. And again, we see that the uniform of the party is used in a different way here, and it's the sash of the anti-sex league that's curled around her body, makes her actually a sex object for Winston. And it's almost like we're starting to see straight away that the goals of the Socialist Party are exposed as a great lie, really. It's like the anti-sex league is the thing that makes her shapely. It makes her noticeable for being a woman because she wears it in the way that she does. Of course, we know she's a very subversive figure in the text anyway. Which again is we see here. It's like the hockey fields and the cold baths and the communal hikes. She is putting out this vision of herself as clean of body and mind, which of course is not the case. She's like I say, she's a subversive figure. But again, it's all done in a handful of words. So it's important to have, when you're describing a character, and not just that, their physique, their carriage, as we've seen with Thomas Gradgrind, as we see with Bezu Fache. It's not enough. You've got to have an end goal in mind. Otherwise, you may as well fall in the camp of Murray Leinster and Robert Heinlein and keep your description to a minimum or eschew it altogether. With that end goal in mind, you have to consider that when you introduce a character trait, or just, in this instance, we're talking about a man with a degree of aggression about him, that you have to keep that going. That has to be consistent. You can't just introduce it and then never use it. I mean, we talked about modern books, but if we talk about three books that all do the same thing, which is City of Bones, Twilight, and 50 Shades of Grey, they all introduce their lead character in a way that sort of introduces them as having a flaw. And in all three cases, it's them being clumsy. It also describes them in a way, not by describing them so much as by saying what they're not. It's Clary. Is it Clary in City of Bones? She's contrasted with her mother, she's Raggedy Ann compared to Barbie. Anastasia Steele is described in a way that compares her to her more glamorous, more attractive friend Kate. And the girl in Twilight, I keep wanting to call her Kristen Stewart. Of course, that's the character in the movie. The actress in the movie. And she says, I should be blue-eyed and sporty, but I'm not. And it's like, does the fact that any of those girls are clumsy ever come up again in those texts? Not significantly. So why bother? It's like, oh, here I am having a flaw, but it's not really a flaw, and it's not a flaw that's ever used. It's kind of pointless. And describing somebody describing somebody else and then taking bits away. So I think it's part why they do come in for a little bit of criticism about not having good leads generally. And certainly you do see in modern times, this seems to be kind of disappearing from books. I mean, when I was preparing for this, I went through quite a lot of the more modern books, and a lot of them seem to be written in the first person, and therefore they obviously don't discuss so much, or certainly not in this sort of way, what their character looks like, how they carry themselves, what sort of things they do. And in fact, one of the ones that I did find was Ken Follett, and I don't want to criticise Ken Follett. I've read a handful of books by him, and I don't mind him at all. But it's interesting to see how his character is described in this one, which is The Eye of the Needle, which I think is from the late 70s, early 80s. It's a film with Donald Sutherland, so it must be around that era, 1978. He was a fine figure of a man, tall, quite heavy around the neck and shoulders, not a bit fat, with long legs, and he had a strong face with a high forehead and a long jaw and bright blue eyes, not pretty like a film star, but the kind of face that appealed to a woman, except for the mouth that was small and thin, and she could imagine him being cruel. So it's like, yeah, there's a little hint that Faber is not all he seems there, but really it is a description purely of what he looks like. There is not trying to do a great deal with that, I don't think. And that sort of thing is like, it might as well be kept to a bare minimum, because when you get it wrong, you really can get it wrong, as in this passage, which is from Hammond Innes. Though her figure was entrancingly neat and boyish, it was her head that inevitably held one's gaze. I think it was the finest head I'd ever seen on a woman. The face was oval to the point of a firm chin, and framed in black hair brushed sleek to the nape of her neck. The mouth was clearly moulded and full enough to give the promise of warmth. The nose was straight and small, with delicately chiselled nostrils, and the thin line of her eyebrows swept upwards over dark eyes to a high forehead. It was difficult to describe her and at the same time give any sense of the extreme perfection of those features. But if you compare Ken Follett's version with, I'm going back to the sort of Victorian era again, with Mary Elizabeth Brannan, the way she talks about Lady Audley and Lady Audley's Secret. The description of Lady Audley does take place on about 3 pages. And there's quite a lot of talk about her smile and her hair and things, and much in the same way as Ken Follett talks about Faber's looks. But there's another passage here that's really, really important. For you see, Miss Lucy Graham was blessed with that magic power of fascination by which a woman can charm with a word or intoxicate with a smile. And what's significant about that is, of course, is that, I mean, you can imagine from a book called Lady Audley's Secret that she's definitely not all that she seems. And she actually, she wins the heart of the wealthy landowner, Lord Audley. And, it's not a book about magic. So it's talking about the way that she's putting a vision of herself forward that isn't actually real. Much the same way as the female character in 1984. Somebody please put in the comments what she's called. I've completely blanked on it. So yeah, two books there doing something very similar, very clever, and then the more modern book, which is kind of just doing it because it feels like it should describe the character, and I think that's the wrong way of going about it. And then, however, this is called Rewriting Bad Books for a reason. That is because we have both rewritten this passage, and I'll start by reading my version of it. So Captain Bezu Fache carried himself like a bull, and everything in Fache's world was a red rag. His nostrils flared as if each breath was a challenge to those around him. His dark hair formed an arrow-like widow's peak that his colleagues claimed, in his absence, only ever pointed at somebody in serious trouble. Today it was pointed at Robert Langdon. So that's it. That's what I've done. Is I basically have changed the animal to an animal that is more famous for its aggression, a bull. If you wanted to up the ante in terms of the violence, or the violent imagery, or the violent language, you could simply change the challenge to those around him as to something like a preparation for violence, be literal about it. So what I've done is in terms of his hair, I've removed the reference to him slicking his hair back with oil. Like I say, if you have sort of a hint of vanity, then it takes away from the next part of your text. If the next part of your text is saying that he has a fierce dedication, an unrelenting focus on his work, the two things are almost incongruous. So that's why I've just gone with one of them. And I've used that arrow-like widow's peak to move us to the next character, our Robert Langdon, who in the text I think has already been introduced at this point. And we've also said, without over-egging it so much, that this is a man perhaps more feared than respected by his colleagues. Anyway, if you want to read your bit, say now. I'll take that as a no. So that means that I'm the victor this week. And I believe that you were winning the series 4-3, but if you don't want to give me your 4 victories and make me lead the series from this point on 7-0, say now. Okay, so obviously I'm the victor this week, and I now lead the series by 7 victories to none, which is quite embarrassing for you. But perhaps in the next episode you might be a little more talkative, because this feels like I've been left to do the whole thing on my own. Well, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.